The dust of the barren plain swirled around Ilara's worn boots, a gritty testament to the aridness of her life, a life declared fruitless by the man who owned her vows, and now, it seemed, her very soul. In the harsh glare of the frontier sun, a woman's worth was often measured by the sons she could bear, the hand she could add to a struggling homestead. Ilara, deemed barren, was therefore deemed worthless, a broken vessel to be discarded or, in this cruelest of turns, sold. Could a spirit so crushed, a heart so bruised by betrayal and public shame, ever find solace, let alone a place to call home, a reason to believe in the dawn of a new day? Was there any corner of this harsh, unyielding land that might offer sanctuary to one so utterly dispossessed? She ain't worth much, but she can cook and clean, I reckon. Amos's voice, like gravel grinding stone, cut through the oppressive silence of the trading post, his words a final, callous dismissal that echoed in the hollows of Ilara's heart. Silas Blackwood watched from the shade of the general store's porch, his face a study in prairie stoicism, yet his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a flicker of something unreadable, pity, perhaps, or a reflection of his own profound loneliness. A widower for 2 long years, his own home echoed with the ghosts of laughter and the unmet needs of 4 motherless children. He'd come for salt and flour, not for a human being, yet the raw, visceral despair radiating from the woman standing beside Amos's wagon, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped in defeat, snagged at something deep within him, a chord of shared sorrow. Amos, a man whose cruelty was etched into the mean set of his jaw and the coldness of his eyes, gestured dismissively towards Ilara. $10, and she's yours. Good for mending, too, when she ain't moping. Ilara flinched, the words striking her like physical blows. $10. The price of a worn-out mule. She clutched the tiny, smoothed wooden bird in her pocket, a relic of a kinder past, its fragile form a desperate anchor in the maelstrom of her shame. Silas pushed himself off the porch post, his movements deliberate. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of felling timber and plowing stubborn earth, his silence often mistaken for indifference, but today, it was a shield. He met Amos's gaze, then his eye shifted to Ilara, lingering for a moment on her tightly clasped hands, the tremor she couldn't conceal. "I'll take her," Silas said, his voice low and steady, carrying no judgment, only a quiet finality. The words hung in the air, heavy and binding. Amos grunted, a flicker of surprise in his avaricious eyes, quickly replaced by a smug satisfaction. The coins exchanged hands, cold and impersonal. Ilara felt a tear escape, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Sold. Again. Her first husband, a kind man taken by fever, had cherished her. Amos, his brother, had inherited her, his property, and had quickly grown to despise her for her childlessness. Now this. Silas merely nodded towards his own wagon. He said, the unfamiliar courtesy a strange balm on her raw wounds. The journey to his homestead was a silent one, the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses the only sounds punctuating the vast emptiness of the land. Ilara sat stiffly, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon, a mirror of the desolation within her. What awaited her? Another master, another life of servitude and silent suffering? She risked a glance at Silas. His profile was stark against the setting sun, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken a word beyond necessity, hadn't offered false comfort or undue familiarity. There was a weariness about him, a deep-seated sorrow that she, in her own pain, could almost recognize. As twilight bled into night, they arrived. The homestead was modest, a cabin nestled amongst a small stand of cottonwoods, a testament to hard work and perseverance. A dog barked, and then the door creaked open, spilling yellow lamplight into the yard. 4 small figures emerged, hesitant, curious. Ilara's breath hitched. Children. 4 of them. The eldest, a girl of perhaps 10, with eyes startlingly like Silas's, looked at Ilara with open suspicion. A boy, a couple of years younger, hid behind her? 2 smaller children, a girl with braided hair and a tiny boy clutching a wooden toy, peeked out from behind their older siblings. Silas swung down from the wagon. "Children," he said, his voice softer than Ilara had yet heard it, "this is Miss Ilara. She'll be staying with us, Miss Ilara." Not the woman I bought, the not your new servant, with a small courtesy, again, was a pinprick of light in her overwhelming darkness. But the children's faces, a mixture of apprehension, loss, and a raw, defensive curiosity, reflected her own fear. Could this place, haunted by a past she didn't know and filled with lives already so deeply intertwined, ever offer more than just another form of bondage? Could a woman deemed broken, sold for her barrenness, truly find a sliver of worth, a moment of peace, in the heart of a family already fractured by its own grief? The first days at Silas Blackwood's homestead were a blur of overwhelming sensations for Ilara. The constant presence of the children, Martha, the eldest, with her mother's watchful eyes and a protective stance that bordered on hostility, Thomas, sturdy and silent, observing Ilara with a solemnity that belied his 8 years, Sarah, a delicate 6-year-old whose shy smiles were as rare and precious as desert blooms, and little Will, barely 4, his thumb perpetually in his mouth, his gaze wide and uncomprehending. The house itself, though sturdily built, bore the unmistakable signs of a household missing a woman's touch. Dust lay thick on the rough-hewn furniture, dishes were haphazardly stacked, and an air of quiet disarray permeated every corner. Ilara, accustomed to Amos's exacting, often brutal, demands for pristine order, felt a strange paralysis. Here, no one ordered her, no one threatened. Silas was out in the fields from before dawn until after dusk, his energy poured into the unyielding land. He left her to her own devices, a freedom so alien it felt like another kind of burden. What was expected of her? The titles Miss Ilara felt like a flimsy veil over the truth of her transaction. She was bought, wasn't she? A housekeeper. A drudge. The word barren echoed in her mind, a cruel brand. How could she, who had failed in the most fundamental way a woman could, possibly nurture these children whose own mother was lost to them? She felt the weight of their silent grief, a palpable presence in the small cabin, mingling with her own. Martha, especially, was a wall of adolescent resentment. "Papa says you're to help," she stated one morning, her voice flat, as Ilara tentatively picked up a broom. "Mama used to." Mama knew how everything was supposed to be. The unspoken accusation hung heavy, "You are not her. You will never be her." Ilara's hand tightened on the broom handle. "I'll do my best, Martha," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Deep inside, the small wooden bird she kept hidden in her apron pocket felt heavy, a reminder of her own brokenness. Silas, when he returned in the evenings, bone-weary and smelling of earth and sweat, would observe Ilara with those quiet, assessing eyes. He saw her tentative efforts, the way she flinched if one of the children moved too quickly near her, the shadows that never quite left her face. He remembered his Martha, her laughter, her warmth, the way she had filled this house with life. The silence now was a constant ache. He hadn't bought Ilara out of charity, not entirely. The children needed care, the house needed tending. But looking at her, seeing the profound sadness in her gaze, he felt an unexpected stirring of something beyond practicality. It was a faint echo of the empathy his late wife had possessed in abundance. He saw not a barren woman, but a soul deeply wounded, much like his own. One afternoon, while Silas was mending a fence near the creek, a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose tongue was known to be as sharp as her quilting needles, rode over. She'd heard the gossip, of course. "Silas Blackwood," she'd begun, her eyes darting towards the cabin where Ilara was trying to coax Will into eating a spoonful of stew. "Folk are talking. Buying a woman, and her with no children to her name from her last. It ain't proper." Silas had straightened slowly, his hammer in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was deceptively mild. "Mrs. Henderson, Miss Ilara is under my roof and my protection. What folks say is their business. What happens on my land is mine." His quiet defense, relayed later by a subdued Thomas who had overheard, sent a small, unfamiliar warmth through Ilara. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but it was a shield. Slowly, tentatively, Ilara began to find small rhythms. She learned that Thomas loved stories, his stern face softening when she recounted tales her own mother had told her. Sarah, she discovered, had a fascination with wildflowers, and Ilara, remembering her own girlhood knowledge of plants, began to point them out, naming them, pressing them in an old book. Will, The youngest was the first to truly breach her defenses. He toddled over one evening while she was mending one of his torn shirts, a task she performed with a skill born of long practice. He'd simply leaned against her knee, his small, warm body a surprising comfort, and fallen asleep. Ilara had frozen, then slowly, carefully, continued her stitching, her heart constricting with an emotion she couldn't name. It felt dangerously like tenderness. One evening, after the children were asleep, a fragile quiet settled over the cabin. Ilara was darning socks by the firelight, the silence thick with unspoken thoughts. Silas sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks sharp in the stillness. Amos, he was not a kind man, Ilara said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. She stared at the sock in her lap, her knuckles white. Silas stopped his work. He didn't press, just waited. He said a woman's only worth was in her womb, she continued, her voice trembling. Mine was empty. So I was empty. She touched her pocket, where the little wooden bird lay. Silas looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the stoicism to the deep well of compassion in his eyes. My Martha, he said, his voice rough with emotion, she lost 2 babes before our Martha was born. Some folks whispered then, too. A person's worth ain't measured by what they can or cannot bear, Ilara. It's measured by the heart they carry. His words, simple and direct, landed like a balm. He called her Ilara, not Miss Ilara. It was a subtle shift, yet profound. But just as this fragile seedling of understanding began to take root, a shadow fell across the threshold. A rider approached the homestead one late afternoon, his silhouette stark against the blood-red sunset. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat, a cold dread washing over her. She knew that posture, that arrogant set of the shoulders. It was one of Amos's men. Had her brief respite already come to an end? Was the tenuous peace she was beginning to find merely a fleeting illusion, soon to be shattered by the cruelty she thought she had escaped? The rider was Jed, Amos's brutish cousin, a man whose loyalty was bought with liquor and the promise of casual cruelty. He dismounted with a swagger, his eyes lingering on Ilara with a leering familiarity that made her skin crawl. Amos sends his regards, Jed sneered, his gaze sweeping over the modest cabin with disdain. Reckons he made a bad bargain. Wants you back, Ilara. Or another $10 for his trouble. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely but purposefully in his hand. The children, sensing the sudden tension, gathered behind him, Martha's small hand clutching his trouser leg. She's not for sale, Jed, Silas stated, his voice dangerously calm. And you're trespassing. Jed's eyes narrowed. Now, Blackwood, no need for unpleasantness. Amos is a reasonable man, but he don't like being cheated. That woman's barren. What use is she to you, really? Ilara flinched as if struck. The word, always the word. But then, something snapped within her. The quiet desperation, the years of cowering, coalesced into a spark of defiance. She stepped forward, standing beside Silas, her chin held high. I am not property, Jed, she said, her voice shaking but clear. And I am not going back. The sight of Ilara, no longer bowed and broken but standing resolute, seemed to momentarily surprise Jed. He looked from her to Silas's unwavering stance, the shotgun a silent promise. He spat on the ground. Amos won't like this. He'll be back. You can count on it. With a final glare, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unease in his wake. The immediate threat had passed, but a chill remained. Amos was not a man to be easily thwarted. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the shadows deeper. But there was a subtle shift in the dynamic. Ilara had spoken, had stood her ground. The children had seen it. Martha's gaze, when it met Ilara's, held a new, grudging respect. A few weeks later, the late summer heat gave way to an early, unseasonal frost, threatening the last of Silas's meager corn crop. It was a devastating blow. They worked side by side, Silas, Ilara, and even Martha and Thomas, trying to salvage what they could, their hands raw, their spirits sinking with each blackened stalk. It was during this shared hardship that Ilara's quiet competence truly began to shine. She knew how to stretch scant provisions, how to make a nourishing soup from almost nothing. She mended their worn clothing with such skill that the patches were nearly invisible. One evening, Little Will developed a cough, a dry, rasping sound that quickly worsened. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Ilara. She remembered her own mother's remedies, herbs gathered from the fields. With Silas's hesitant permission, she brewed a tea from horehound and mullein she'd spotted growing near the creek. She sat with Will through the night, bathing his fevered brow, coaxing sips of the warm liquid past his lips. Silas watched her, his heart a turmoil of anxiety for his son and a growing admiration for this woman who, despite her own deep wounds, possessed such a capacity for gentle care. By morning, Will's fever had lessened, his breathing easier. Silas found Ilara asleep in the rocking chair, Will cradled in her arms, her face pale with exhaustion but peaceful. He gently covered them both with a quilt. The incident with Jed, however, had stirred the hornet's nest of local gossip. Whispers followed Ilara when she occasionally accompanied Silas to the small, dusty town for supplies. "That's the woman Blackwood bought," she heard them murmur. "Baron, they say Amos Culpepper's cast off the judgment was a constant, invisible weight." The small wooden bird in Ilara's pocket seemed to pulse with her own remembered pain. She'd once shown it to Sarah, explaining how her father had carved it for her, a symbol of freedom and hope. Sarah, with a child's simple wisdom, had touched it reverently. "It's a pretty bird, Miss Ilara. It looks like it wants to fly." Amos did return, not in person at first, but his malice spread like a pestilence. He began to circulate rumors, vile insinuations about Ilara and Silas, painting himself as the wronged husband. He spoke of witchcraft, of Ilara having cursed his land and his prospects. Some, already predisposed to suspicion, listened. One Sunday, the circuit preacher, Reverend Miller, a stern man with eyes that seemed to pierce through to one's very soul, fixed his gaze upon Silas and Ilara during his sermon. Though he named no names, his words about sinful arrangements and women of questionable virtue bringing ill fortune upon a household were pointed and unmistakable. Ilara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the weight of the congregation's stares. But Silas reached over and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. His silent support was a bulwark against the preacher's condemnation. The small act did not go unnoticed. Later, as they were leaving, Martha, who had witnessed the exchange, slipped her small hand into Ilara's other one. It was a tiny gesture, but it spoke volumes. The fragile bonds were strengthening, tested by external threats and internal fears, but holding. Yet, as the autumn winds began to blow colder, carrying the scent of winter and renewed hardship, Ilara couldn't shake the premonition that Amos's shadow still loomed large. Was this small family, forged in shared sorrow and tentative hope, strong enough to withstand the storms he was so determined to unleash? Or would his bitterness finally succeed in tearing them, and her fragile new sense of self, apart? The whispers intensified after Reverend Miller's thinly veiled sermon. Some townsfolk, swayed by Amos's venomous tales or their own rigid piety, began to shun Silas and his family. Storekeepers were curt, old acquaintances suddenly too busy for a greeting. The isolation pressed in on them, a tangible force. Ilara felt it most keenly, the barbs of baron and bought woman echoing in the marketplace, in the averted gazes of other women. It was a constant reminder of her past, a past Amos seemed determined to chain her to forever. But within the walls of their small cabin, a different story was unfolding. The shared defense against Jed, the collective effort to save the frostbitten corn, and Ilara's tender nursing of Will had woven new threads into the family fabric. Martha, once so openly hostile, now sought Ilara's help with her school lessons and even shared small confidences. Thomas, still quiet, would often bring Ilara a curiously shaped stone or a vibrant autumn leaf, small offerings laid gently on the kitchen table. Sarah chatted to her constantly, her shyness replaced by an open affection, and Will followed Ilara like a devoted shadow. The little wooden bird, once a secret solace, now sometimes sat on the window-sill, catching the light, a silent testament to a spirit slowly unclenching. Then, the real trial came. Not from Amos, not directly, but from the harshness of the land itself. A bitter cold snap descended early, far more severe than usual, and with it came a sickness that swept through the nearby settlements. It started with Sarah. A fever, then a deep, racking cough that stole her breath and left her weak and listless. Fear, stark and primal, gripped Silas. He'd lost his first Martha to a fever that had come on just as swiftly. Now, watching his little girl struggle, the old terror resurfaced, raw and consuming. Ilara, too, felt a cold dread, but beneath it, a fierce determination ignited. She would not let this child slip away. She remembered more of her mother's lore, the poultices for the chest, the steam inhalations with pine needles, the bone broth simmered for hours to coax strength back into a failing body. For days and nights, she barely slept, tending to Sarah with a devotion that went beyond mere duty. She sponged the child's burning skin, whispered soothing words, held her small hand, and prayed with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. Silas was a constant presence, his face etched with anxiety, but his trust in Ilara was absolute. He chopped wood for the endless fires needed to keep the cabin warm and boil water. He held Sarah when Ilara needed to rest, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He saw the exhaustion in Ilara's eyes, the paleness of her skin, but also the unwavering resolve. This was not the broken woman he had taken from Amos. This was a woman of incredible strength, her love for his child a fierce, protective flame. The news of Sarah's grave illness reached the town, carried on the wind with the falling snow. Mrs. Henderson, her earlier sharpness blunted by genuine concern, rode out with a basket of hoarded preserves and a worried frown. But another figure also took note, Agnes Periwinkle, the preacher's wife, a woman whose righteousness was as starched as her bonnets. She saw Sarah's illness not as a tragedy, but as a judgment. "It is the Lord's will," she pronounced to anyone who would listen in the general store. When unnatural unions are formed, when women of ill repute are brought into decent homes, sickness follows. That barren woman has brought a curse upon the Blackwood household. Her words, cruel and self-assured, found fertile ground in some frightened hearts. One afternoon, as Silas was in town desperately trying to find a doctor, an impossible task in the dead of winter, Agnes Periwinkle, accompanied by two other stern-faced churchwomen, appeared at the homestead. Ilara, her face drawn with fatigue, met them at the door. "We have come to pray for the child," Mrs. Periwinkle announced, her eyes sweeping disdainfully over Ilara. "And to speak to you, woman, about the state of your soul and the shadow you have cast." Ilara stood her ground. "Sarah needs rest, not a committee," she said, her voice low but firm. "And my soul is between me and my Maker." "Mrs. Periwinkle, harlotry and godlessness bring blight," one of the other women hissed. "You were bought like cattle. You have no place here." Just then, Martha stepped out from the cabin's dim interior. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from worry and lack of sleep, but her voice was strong. "Leave her alone," she cried, surprising them all. "Miss Ilara is good. She's taking care of Sarah. She loves us. You're the ones casting shadows with your mean words." Before Mrs. Periwinkle could retort, Thomas appeared, standing solidly beside his sister, his expression fierce. Even little Will, awakened by the commotion, peeked out, his eyes wide. The united front of the children, their fierce loyalty to Ilara so openly displayed, momentarily stunned the churchwomen. Agnes Periwinkle's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The conviction in their young voices, the raw love and defense, was a force she hadn't anticipated. Defeated, or perhaps shamed into silence, she and her companions turned and left, their pronouncements of doom trailing off into the biting wind. Ilara pulled the children close, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love that mirrored their own. That night, as a blizzard raged outside, Sarah's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, and a faint touch of color returned to her cheeks. Ilara wept, silent tears of exhaustion and profound relief, her head resting against the rough-hewn wall beside Sarah's small bed. When Silas returned, empty-handed but his spirit lifting at the sight of his recovering daughter and the quiet strength of the woman who had saved her, he found them like that. He knelt beside Ilara, taking her chapped hand in his. No words were needed. The storm outside might continue its fury, and the judgment of some in the community might still linger like a bitter frost, but within the warm heart of their cabin, something unbreakable had been forged. Was it enough, though? Would this hard-won peace, this testament of love against the odds, finally silence the cruelties of the past and the prejudices of the present? The recovery of Sarah Blackwood was slow but steady, each small improvement of victory celebrated quietly within the cabin walls. Ilara's tireless nursing, her knowledge of old remedies, became the stuff of hushed legend, first among the children, then slowly, reluctantly, filtering out into the wider community. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the churchwomen's retreat and heard Martha's fierce defense, was one of the first to openly revise her opinion. That Ilara, she declared at the quilting circle, has more Christian charity in her little finger than Agnes Periwinkle has in her whole pious frame. Saved that child, she did, when no doctor could be found. Her words, carrying the weight of a respected elder, began to turn the tide of local sentiment. Agnes Periwinkle, somewhat chastened by the children's unexpected rebellion and the undeniable fact of Sarah's recovery, found her pronouncements carrying less and less weight. The community, having faced its own fears during the sickness, was perhaps more inclined towards gratitude than judgment. The symbolic wooden bird on Ilara's windowsill now seemed to gleam a little brighter, a small beacon of resilience. The incident had transformed Ilara. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had receded, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had faced down judgment, nursed a child back from the brink, and in doing so, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer just Amos's cast-off or the barren woman. She was Ilara, a woman of substance, a woman loved. Silas watched this transformation with a heart full of emotions he was only beginning to understand. His initial arrangement with Ilara had been one of necessity, a desperate bid to keep his family from unraveling. But her quiet grace, her unwavering kindness to his children, and now, her fierce, life-saving devotion, had chipped away at the walls around his own grieving heart. He found himself seeking her company in the evenings, not just for the comfort of a tended home, but for the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the gentle cadence of her voice. He saw not a purchased woman, but a partner, a companion, a spirit as strong and resilient as the ancient cottonwoods that sheltered their home. Their shared ordeal with Sarah's illness had forged an intimacy deeper than words. One crisp spring morning, as the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, a different kind of threat materialized. A band of rough-looking men, rumored to be army deserters turned outlaws, had been sighted in the area, preying on isolated homesteads. Fear rippled through the small community. Silas, along with other men, organized patrols. Ilara, though anxious, refused to be cowed. She taught Martha and Thomas how to barricade the door, where to hide if trouble came. Her calm resolve was infectious. The outlaws struck a neighboring farm, stealing livestock and terrorizing the family. The next day, they were seen heading towards the Blackwood homestead. Silas was miles away on patrol. Panic seized Ilara for a moment, then her newfound strength asserted itself. "Martha, Thomas, the door," she commanded. "Sarah, Will, under the big bed, and stay quiet, no matter what." As the children scrambled to obey, Ilara grabbed Silas's heavy rifle from its pegs above the mantel. Her hands were surprisingly steady. She'd watched Silas clean and load it countless times. She checked the ammunition, her movements quick and efficient. The pounding on the door began, rough and demanding. "Open up in there." "We know you're alone, woman," a coarse voice shouted. Ilara positioned herself by the small window, the rifle aimed. "This is Silas Blackwood's property," she called out, her voice clear and strong, betraying none of the fear churning inside her. "He'll be back any minute with the patrol. You'd best move on." A harsh laugh from outside. "We ain't afraid of no patrol. Open this door, or we'll break it down and take what we want." The wood of the door shuddered under a heavy blow. Ilara took a deep breath. She saw a face peer through a crack. She fired. The shot was high, meant to warn, splintering the wood above the man's head. He yelled in surprise and anger. Another outlaw tried to kick the door in. Ilara fired again, this time aiming lower, hitting the door jamb near his leg. He howled and stumbled back. The assault paused. They hadn't expected such fierce resistance from a lone woman. Just then, the sound of approaching horses and men's shouts echoed from the distance. The patrol, alerted by the gunshots, was returning. The outlaws, realizing they were outmatched and outmaneuvered, cursed and fled into the trees. When Silas and the men arrived, they found Ilara, pale but resolute, the rifle still in her hands, the children emerging, shaken but safe. The story of her bravery spread like wildfire. The woman who had been scorned, that barren a woman, had defended her home and children with the courage of a lioness. Amos Culpepper, hearing of Ilara's heroism and the community's growing admiration for her, made one last, desperate bid to reclaim what he considered his. He rode into town, blustering and threatening, demanding the sheriff return his wife, but the town was no longer listening to him. Silas stood before him, no longer just a stoic widower, but a man fiercely protective of the woman he loved. "Ilara is not your wife, Amos," Silas said, his voice ringing with conviction. "She is my heart. And this community stands with her." The sheriff, backed by a crowd of townsfolk who had once whispered but now stood firm, ordered Amos to leave and never return. Defeated, his malice finally impotent, Amos rode away, a bitter, diminished figure swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, Silas found Ilara by the creek, the little wooden bird resting on a smooth stone beside her. He sat down, taking her hand. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you came into my life when it was broken, much like your little bird. You mended not just my home, but my heart, and the hearts of my children. You are the bravest, kindest, strongest woman I have ever known." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, braided gold ring, his mother's. "This ain't much, but it's all I have to offer that's truly mine. Ilara, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, and a mother to our children, not by purchase or by duty, but by love?" Tears streamed down Ilara's face, tears of joy this time, washing away the last vestiges of her old sorrow. "Yes, Silas," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Oh, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The children, who had been watching from a respectful distance, ran towards them, their faces alight with joy. Martha, Thomas, Sarah, and will envelop them in a group hug, a true family, forged in hardship, strengthened by love, and finally, unequivocally, whole. The little wooden bird, no longer a symbol of a crushed spirit, but of a soul that had learned to fly, seemed to sing silently in the golden light of their new beginning. The woman once deemed worthless had found her true value, not in her womb, but in the boundless capacity of her heart, a heart now cherished, a love now freely given and joyfully received.